This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
This is Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
It is Fun Friday. My name is Jeff Sandhu. When you look at the world around you, it can seem like we're living in dark and dangerous times. World leaders who order and abort missile strikes, technology companies that depict a world of calm and orderliness as long as you follow their rules. And then there's Matt, a man who can find a sliver of darkness at the end of every tunnel. Matt, welcome to the show. I believe our topic for today is the Chaos Factory, but what do you mean?
Hey, Jeff. Well, today's show comes from actually a slightly unusual source. Plenty of MSP shows begin with something weird or silly that some tech supremo has muttered in the press. But, usually we start from this kind of negative point. The Chaos Factory is a term that Apple CEO Tim Cook used for Silicon Valley in his commencement speech to the class of 2019 at Stanford University on 16th of June, and I'm glad I've got through that sentence. That seems to encapsulate a lot of the shows we do. And it goes back to what we've been talking about this year, especially in the Disruption series.
And that's the idea that chaos and disruption is intrinsically good.
Yeah, it's this idea of scorched earth creation, that you have to burn everything that came before and that there can only be one victor. But, it's not Highlander. There can be only one is not a mantra that most people live by. If it was, it would be an incredibly boring life.
In what way?
Well, if you think about it, you apply the same logic as the only search engine is Google. Mm-hmm. You apply that to other things. So the only place we could eat would be McDonald's or KFC. There wouldn't be any other restaurants. We can only shop at Giant. The only car we could drive would be a Proton. The only trees we would have would be pine trees, and the only flowers would be daffodils. And of course, the only pet anyone would have are gerbils. And all of those things are fine. But our lives are more interesting and improved because of variety.
Not to mention the fact that gerbil videos are pretty dull.
Well, I know, scene one, seen them all. They're like vanilla hamsters. And, it's like, no, I'm clever. I can use a drip bottle and a wheel. But, it's a point that Tim Cook also makes in his speech.
That he's not a fan of hamsters?
I've really no idea about that bit. But no, the variety part, he makes the point from his point of view of privacy. So essentially that we exercise self-censorship at the same time that we're fed this same drip feed of information and influences. And this has a chilling effect on imagination. And that's kind of the ultimate irony. Disruption is generally the product of imagination, but the net effect of that imagination is to stifle the imagination of others.
Not that we're opposed to esoteric arguments. It wouldn't be MSP without them. But why should we care?
Well, we should care because the ultimate aim is to make us not care. The aim is to make us accept. In the same way we're supposed to be glad that the US president averted a missile strike on Iran, it overlooks the fact that he ordered it to begin with. Despite its name, it's all too easy to normalize chaos.
To confuse the hero with the villain.
Well, in a sense, it's like watching one of those Marvel shows on Netflix when the hero appeals to some underlying sense of decency in the arch-villain, and you cheer because he doesn't flood Hell's Kitchen with sarin gas or whatever the big denouement that series was leading up to. But you lose sight of the fact that all of that chaos led to that moment and that realization. It's why we have that phrase, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, or the notion that the darkest hour is just before the dawn. But in the Chaos Factory, the hero and the villain are actually one and the same. And they're the ones switching the light on and off to decide when it's dark and when dawn breaks.
In the speech, Tim Cook does mention the positives that Silicon Valley has brought.
And those things are undeniable, prosperity and technology, and they've transformed the way we work. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those developments have been brought about because of competition. Apple and Microsoft fought to develop the best graphical user interface. Now, obviously, the one that developed the best graphical user interface didn't actually win, but that's because Microsoft went the OEM route and made computing truly affordable for pretty much everyone. It's easy to forget that smartphones were initially fought on or rather the battle for smartphones was initially fought on three different fronts. You had the PDAs, the personal digital assistants. So you had Windows, you had Palm, you had Psion, all with competing operating systems. Companies like Dell and Sony were duking it out for the hardware. Over with the pre-smartphones, we had Nokia and Ericsson and Motorola and Alcatel. And that was a really tight battle. But Nokia was, very far and away the leader of that. And there really was no one else competing with BlackBerry for quite a number of years. If email was your thing, then BlackBerry was your default.
And now we have Android and iOS.
Yeah, by and large. And it's not even a real battle between those two. We live in Android's world. Apple is for those people who are trapped and boxed in early adopters like me and people who basically earn too much money. Facebook and Amazon have tried to dip their toes into the smartphone crocodile pit. Now they have fewer toes. Huawei will probably have to concentrate on its own operating system, which, if you're a government worried about the ownership and influence of that company, is probably a worse scenario than having it use a custom version of Android, which is an OS that is widely understood by programmers. But this is where chaos takes you.
Is Apple any better than the companies that Tim Cook is taking an aim at?
Well, here's the thing. Cook kind of channels his Chaos Factory argument down the privacy route. We've talked so much this year about tech companies being self-serving, and this is kind of another example of that. So last week we talked about health devices and how Apple wants its watch to be at the center of our discussions about health. That's great. Apple's attitude to data sharing is definitely a bonus there. But the company is hardly at the forefront of cooperation and interoperability.
So you're still locked into Apple's walled garden.
Yeah, and that walled garden is increasingly looking a little overgrown, poorly tended, and a bit tired. The phones are a couple of generations behind the best Android devices now. And certainly the operating system on Android is way, way ahead. The computer and tablet updates are less frequent and very uninspiring. Siri is, personable, but when you compare it to what Google and Amazon are doing with voice, it's a bit like comparing, a Trabant to a Tesla. It took what seemed like forever for the Apple Watch to achieve the feat of being waterproof. Something you take for granted as a feature on a $10 watch you buy at the filling station. And as for the company's attitude to proprietary ports and dongles, please don't get me started. It sometimes feels like I need a suitcase full of chargers, adapters, and headphone cables just to get through a day of work. And for all this, Apple is still convinced that we should pay 2 or 3 times the price that products from its rivals cost. That's an enormous premium to pay for not needing antivirus software. And that's pretty much the only advantage I can think that Apple has these days.
So the commencement speech has an element of sour grapes on it?
No, I don't think so. But I think this is maybe where Cook loses control of his argument. Continuity and progression are great, but the Apple of 2019 seems to be about to lapse into stagnation. So the big development at their developer conference this year was the separate OS for tablets that gives its iPads a more computer-like functionality. I'm sorry, Microsoft has been pushing the successful marriage of those formats for years and years already.
Especially as we're on the verge of just throwing computers away.
Well, precisely. So I downloaded the public beta of the iPhone software that came out a few days ago. It's good, but it's still only as good as Android was a couple of generations ago. That's not enough when we are, like you said, at the precipice of this voice-activated, largely screenless revolution. And Apple is still trying to make its tablets do half the job its laptops have always done. It reminds me of that moment in the late 1990s when Microsoft decided that the internet wouldn't catch on, and then spent a decade chasing its own tail. In fact, I think it was this week Bill Gates commented that one of his biggest regrets at Microsoft was not developing a product that was as good or as strong as Android.
But surely your argument is that outside of Apple's Castle Black, there are only wildlings and White Walkers.
Or The Walking Dead, if you want another overused analogy. And I asked Jeff to use that overused Game of Thrones analogy in case anyone thinks that I'm being snippy. But yeah, it's almost like putting a trampoline against the wall so that you can peer over it, and the grass really does look greener in the next garden. It might be fake grass, but at least the entrance fee is a lot lower. You know, it might cost you more in the long run. You might even have to give up a kidney to actually leave. But you're still being lumped into Apple's walled garden.
So it's a good thing that Tim Cook gave this speech?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really great speech, but I don't think that speech should be coming from Apple because, like it or not, the company is still part of the problem. I want to see Apple doing their part, their share, to solve these problems. Whereas, you know, throwing shade at your competitors is really easy. Solving problems is much more difficult.
All right, after the break, what exactly is Matt's problem? Well, stay tuned. MSP BFM 89.9.
You're listening to Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
Because friends matter. BFM 89.9, the business station.
You're listening to Tech Talk, made possible by TM1.
And we're back. It's Fun Friday. My name is Jeff Sandhu, together with Culture Pop's Matt Armitage. Before the break, we were talking about the Chaos Factory. This is a term that's used by Apple CEO Tim Cook in a speech to Stanford University just a few weeks ago. Now I get to ask my very favorite question. Matt, what is your problem?
God, how long is an indeterminate quantum loop? No, I was listening to a completely unrelated podcast just this morning. It's called White Lies. I think I've mentioned it on the show before, at least on Geek Squawk anyway. It's from NPR. It's about the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s, and it relates to an unsolved murder in Selma, Alabama. Now, one of the interviewees on the show said a really interesting thing. Without empathy, there's chaos. And that's the thing that Silicon Valley seems to lack, that sense of empathy. It's why their vision of disruption is not about innovation and empowerment. It's about destruction and entitlement. It's deliberately breaking something, telling you they have the solution to fix what they broke, and that it's going to cost you more money than it did before.
Are you still including Apple in this?
It's interesting. Tim Cook kind of touches on it in his speech. Cook says that companies have to take responsibility, and I agree, but that goes way beyond privacy. It's about the techno equivalent of nation building. We can take, I think, Libra as an example.
You're talking about Facebook's new cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I mean, we'll do an episode in a week or two specifically about Libra, but in case people don't know, Facebook wants its own payment system. That's not something that was unexpected. If I was Facebook, I would too. And we've mentioned on the show before that e-wallets are kind of stealing a march on the social media providers because they have a core service that is useful, which is, of course, paying for stuff. And they're adding all kinds of other elements to their ecosystems. Gaming, which, of course, you pay for, buying food, ordering cars, online shopping, instant messaging that doubles as peer-to-peer money transfer systems. And these wallets are increasingly offering banking and credit services as well as being this medium of exchange.
All right, for the people, it's not obvious for why does Facebook want a piece of this market?
Well, Facebook and companies like it are constantly trying to make their core service compelling. But their core service is what the e-wallets see as being their add-ons. And think how many times a day you make transactions, either small ones or large ones. Public transport, tolls, petrol, snacks, lunch, groceries, light shopping, drinks after work. You know, it goes on and on and on.
A bit like you.
But without the benefit of opting out or turning down the volume. No, we talk about internet addiction, and I'm certainly not saying that tech companies are trying to get us addicted, but they do try and cultivate and develop our habits. So any app like an e-wallet that you open dozens of times a day becomes your go-to app. How many times have you just unthinkingly opened Facebook or Twitter, either because you're bored or because that's simply something you do when you check your phone? And then you stare at the screen, hoping that it's going to do something that will excite or entertain you.
And the go-to nature of e-wallets is a threat to companies like Facebook.
Well, look how tightly woven e-wallets and social media are in China, a country that Facebook doesn't have access to. There are huge swaths of the world where people are more likely to have a WhatsApp account than a bank account. And yes, WhatsApp is a great way to transfer cash. So much so that telcos across the African continent have been offering those same services via SMS for years and years already. So you have to ask whose need Facebook is addressing, its own or those who have been disenfranchised by the banking system.
Yeah, but isn't that one of those arguments for Libra, that it can extend banking services or functionality to people outside?
Yeah, but that's something that most blockchain-based currencies and financial systems also lay claim to. And that's where we come back to that idea of responsibility. If Facebook's goal was altruism, it could have poured its resources into an NGO or an open source system independent of its own ecosystem, or something that would independently hook into its ecosystem. It certainly doesn't need to own its own currency. You know, it's easy for me to send sterling to friends or family in the UK, or to buy goods in other currencies on sites like Amazon or, you know, whatever other retail site.
And I guess the argument is that an actual currency is easy for everyone to understand.
Sure, if we're all using the same currency, it is easy to understand, especially if you don't have a calculator or a currency converter, or maybe a transaction receipt that automatically shows you the amount in both currencies. Oh, but hang on, you're using Facebook, so you have a smartphone, so you have all of those things already.
So you see this as another virtual land grab?
Well, this is why Tim Cook's Chaos Factory speech is so true and at the same time so ironic. You know, we see this time and again, and it's very symptomatic of the way the Chaos Factory works. A tech leader, in this case Mark Zuckerberg, tells us something that is true. It's true. Blockchain is a great way to extend financial services to those in casual occupations or in countries where regular banking is either basically for the middle classes or distributed too unequally to be useful to most of the population. But those facts exist independently of Facebook. Facebook doesn't own those facts. It doesn't even have anything to do with those facts until the moment that it chooses to insert itself into that argument.
And we see the language shift.
Yeah, then it becomes Libra is a tool to enfranchise those people outside the banking system, not blockchain is a tool. It's not wrong, but you're co-opting ideas from elsewhere and making yourself look like the great savior when actually this is an act of self-interest. It reminds me of another story that came up this week. Sidewalk Labs, which is Alphabet's, I think, urban innovation project. Now, it has a pending billion-dollar housing and retail project planned for Toronto, one that it hopes will be a model of sustainable and environmentally conscious living.
All the things that you bitterly oppose.
Yeah, I'm completely opposed to affordable, good quality housing. But this is another one of those inserting yourself into the problem and calling it a solution issues. Questions have arisen from some of the bodies involved in approving Toronto development projects relating to the business model and the data usage of this project. And those same Chaos Factory models that Tim Cook spoke about. The Guardian reported that venture capitalist Roger McNamee wrote to the Toronto City Council, labelling the project as highly evolved surveillance capitalism. This is a venture capitalist, labelling it as surveillance capitalism. And he suggested that the company might be able to use its algorithms to nudge human behavior.
But that's assuming there's bad intentions there.
Yes, but in the Chaos Factory, companies don't help themselves. So Sidewalk Labs CEO Dan Doctoroff, a former deputy mayor of New York, is quoted in the same piece as acknowledging that if the product doesn't meet Sidewalk Labs' goals, then it will withdraw. Now, I'm sure that's not intended as a threat, but when you estimate that a project will create over 40,000 jobs, earn billions of dollars in tax revenue for the city, and add billions more dollars to Canada's GDP, and then you say you're quite happy to walk away from it, that makes you very different from most real estate developers. And then you hear that someone like former BlackBerry CEO Jim Balsillie has publicly called the project a grab for land, power and control. And again, in an email to The Guardian, he called it an assault on democracy. And when you hear stuff like that, it does make you wonder, what is the intent here?
And what is the intent here?
Don't ask me. That's the whole point. We should be asking these questions of the tech companies we interact with. Are these companies trying to replace or subvert our governments? Why does Facebook need its own currency? Does Alphabet intend to create and implement a social credit system similar to the one in China for residents of its development? Chaos clouds clarity. Governments, for all we abuse them, are generally accountable to us. If we're lucky, we get to throw them out of office every few years if we think their behavior is not what we expect.
And it's something that we can't do with companies.
No, especially countries that start behaving like nation states. And that brings us back around to Tim Cook and Apple. Yes, Apple is better at handling its users' data and privacy because it has the luxury of us paying it for everything. But I want to see Apple and Facebook and all the other big tech companies trying to solve the problems. We're talking about companies that are actually richer than many developing nations and who claim to be committed to building a progressive vision of the future. So I want to see them helping to solve things like the inequality they've created in California and elsewhere, spreading the resources of the people they hire out across the world, paying their contract workers a decent living salary, supporting employees in their efforts to unionize, stamping out the gender or racial disparities that their products and tools have been shown to reinforce, and of course, to stop offshoring their revenues and finding these creative ways to structure holding companies and accounting entities. And it's like the historian Rutger Bregman said at Davos this year, taxes, taxes, taxes.
Do you think they're listening?
Not to me, but they should be listening to everyone who's listening to this. Operating a chaos factory is a great way to divert our attention from all these issues. And it's so easy for us to become tired by all that endless churn and simply to switch off. But switching off and blindly accepting their vision of our future is exactly what Silicon Valley is banking on. And we've seen what happens when someone tells them no. They're not used to it and they throw a tantrum. But as any parent who has lived through the horrors of a 3-year-old can tell you, it's something we have to force them to get used to.
The chaos factory.
Yes, I've got just one quick note. I will be speaking at the Architects Design Conference on Saturday, the 6th of July at KLCC at 3 p.m. My topic is the perfect society, so I'll be letting off plenty of metaphorical bombs. Entrance is free, but you do have to pre-register at architects.com.my.
All right, and that's all for MSP. We'll be right back with Geek Squawks after this. You can also download the podcast available on the BFM website, or you want to get transcripts, it's available at culturepop.com. We'll be right back. BFM 89.9.
Tech Talk, made possible by TM1. To learn more, visit tm1.com.my.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.